The United States is massing more naval forces off the coast of Venezuela. President Trump is sending America's largest aircraft carrier to help stop the small boats that he says are transporting drugs to the US. His administration says 57 people have been killed in US strikes on these alleged drug boats. On Wednesday, he said US forces had almost completely stopped the drugs coming into America by sea. Speculations therefore growing about what the USS Gerald R. Ford's mission in the Caribbean could be. Donald Trump says he hasn't ruled out strikes on land-based targets in Venezuela. He says the US is in armed conflict with the cartels there. But Venezuela accuses the American president of using drug trafficking claims to fabricate a war in Latin America.
US strikes on what it says are drug smuggling boats have been escalating for weeks. Dozens of people have been killed in the attacks in international waters. Donald Trump maintains it's part of a campaign to stop drugs flowing into the US.
The Navy has supported our mission to blow the cartel terrorists the hell out of the water. You see that? And you know, there are no boats in the water anymore. You can't find any. We're having a hard time finding them.
Despite Trump's claims, the deadly boat strikes have continued. And as the number grows, so do questions about their legality and motivation.
It murders civilians without providing information as to their identity, without providing the nature of the cargo aboard the vessels, and without providing any evidence on the imminent nature of an armed attack against US forces. This is not self-defense. These are extrajudicial executions.
Venezuela says the boat strikes are part of a wider attack and aim to overthrow President Nicolás Maduro's regime. Maduro faces charges of narco-terrorism in the US with a $50 million bounty for his capture.
And Trump believes that Nicolás Maduro is an illegitimate president leading an illegitimate regime that has been trafficking drugs to the United States of America for far too long, and we're not going to tolerate it.
Analysts say while drugs do flow through Venezuela, they're usually headed to Europe, with the Pacific route preferred by traffickers trying to reach the United States. The US has been ramping up its military presence in the Caribbean. There are now 10,000 Marines, at least 8 warships, a submarine, drones and fighter jets in the region, an unprecedented show of force to confront suspected drug boats.
Nicolás Maduro is a brutal dictator, and I think this administration is interested in advancing democracy in Venezuela. But the other reality is that Venezuela is home to the world's largest oil reserves on the planet. It has been the source of a migration crisis that has led 8 million Venezuelans to flee the country. And of course, Venezuela is something of a staging ground for Chinese and Russian influence in the Western Hemisphere. So I think for all these reasons, the Trump administration has Venezuela in its crosshairs.
The US military presence in the area is being beefed up even further with its biggest aircraft carrier, perhaps the strongest sign yet that Trump's war on drug boats may have other aims.
John Feeley is Executive Director for the Centre for Media Integrity of the Americas. Before that, though, he served in the US State Department, where he was one of its top Latin American experts. Most recently, he was US Ambassador to Panama. So welcome to DW. Does the United States really need 3 destroyers, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, amphibious assault ships, gunships, Tomahawk missiles and thousands of troops to defend itself from drug smugglers trying to get their contraband to Europe?
Most certainly not, Phil. And I think you've done a very nice rundown of the order of battle that the Trump administration currently has in the South Caribbean Sea. No, look, the problem that many of us here in the United States and around the world have with this deployment is not that we are soft on Nicolás Maduro or drug traffickers. It's that the stated reason for this massive deployment, the largest one in anyone's living memory to Latin America or in the Latin American theater, which is a region of peace, which really hasn't had a state-on-state conflict since the 1990s between Peru and Ecuador. The problem that we have is that the stated intention of this flotilla, of this armada, is to fight drugs. And in point of fact, what they've done is they've sent an absolute sledgehammer where really what you need is a surgeon's scalpel. So no, I would say the answer is there's no reason that this deployment will be any more effective in combating the transshipment of drugs than has been the Coast Guard's way of doing it under the rule of law for the past 40 years.
OK, it's interesting, though, you phrase that, because you take, therefore, at face value the Trump administration's statement that this flotilla is there to deal with drugs, because people look at it and say, well, is it really? You need all this to deal with those drug dealers? This looks more like a regime change through threat, through gunboat diplomacy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I do share that suspicion, Phil. My experience both as a young Marine helicopter pilot flying off one of the ships that's stationed down there right now, as well as an American diplomat working 30-odd years and working a lot of counter-narcotics activities in Latin America, is that this is so patently and manifestly the wrong tool for the job that there has to be an ulterior motive. And the only motive that any of us can come up with is that this is regime change, I would say on the cheap, except it's not really on the cheap because it's quite expensive to keep this flotilla floating around down there. I mean, 10 F-35s in Puerto Rico, B-1 bombers coming out of Dyess Air Force Base, B-52s flying close to Venezuelan airspace. This is a lot of military huffing and puffing to blow down Nicolás Maduro's house. And it's a huge bet as to whether or not it's going to be sufficient without actually committing American boots on the ground in Venezuela to start another foreign war. I am very skeptical, like many, that this is a very improvised and ultimately will be a failure as a policy.
OK, so let's follow the thought. Let's cross drugs off the list and let's look at regime change. If we're looking at regime change, we're looking at either threats from offshore or an invasion. You just crossed off invasion. So how does threats from offshore, how does that work? If there is a scenario in which this can work, how does that work? The United States places its flotilla off the coast of Venezuela, and then what?
Okay, you've just raised two good points. Let me get back to one thing, though. When I say that I've crossed drugs, or you say that I've crossed drugs off the list, let me make very clear that critics of the Trump policy in Venezuela or in the South Caribbean, like me, we are not in any way, shape, or form minimizing the threat to American national security or, frankly, to American health and well-being that illegal narcotics represents.
Understood.
Our point is that there is a way to fight this within the rule of law. And Marco Rubio has very clearly said, the Secretary of State has very clearly said, well, we tried that, it didn't work, so now we're just going to start schwacking these boats out of the water, which I find personally to be a serious violation of both U.S. domestic and international law and possibly a war crime. So yes, I cross off the usage of this flotilla as an effective counter-narcotics tool, but I don't minimize the threat that counter-narcotics is to the United States. With regard to the second point, though, all right, how does that work, right? Because Donald Trump ran on a ticket of getting the United States out of foreign wars. And I think many others firmly believe that, when he looks himself in the mirror, he says, the last thing I want to do is put Marines on the shore of Maiquetía so that they can get in there and topple Nicolás Maduro. So I think, sadly, my Marine brothers are going to sit on those boats for a while and just keep cleaning their weapons and not see much activity. But the way it might work is that, and this is what I think the Trump administration is betting on, although I'm not privy to their inside thinking, is that if you launch a few Tomahawk missiles from international waters, which the United States Navy can easily do and has had plenty of practice and can be extremely precise with its Aegis guided missile system on those 3 destroyers and the cruiser, and you launch a few of these missiles, you're going to scare enough mid-range Venezuelan security forces, both in the National Guard and in the army, and perhaps in the intelligence and security structures that surround Maduro and his cronies, because that's the only way Maduro stays in power.
Okay, so that's how it might work if that's the thinking in the White House. Let's look at.
I think that is the thinking.
Let's look at going back to taking the president at face value. The US has killed anywhere between 30 and 60 people in this deployment, in 13 or so raids, and the president has talked about killing these so-called narco-terrorists. And to listen to that, you can see people getting, yes, let's get the bad guys. But then you look at the detail and you read, well, first of all, is narco-terrorists an actual thing? And does the US just get to kill them without due process?
Exactly the questions critics like me are asking, and we haven't gotten any good answers to it. Look, Title 21 of the U.S. Code, which is the law under which narcotics trafficking is prosecuted by law here in the United States, does not include the death penalty for even the worst drug traffickers. Chapo Guzman, the Mexican cartel leader, Mayo Zambada, his number 2 for years, who's now, guest of the United States prison system. All of these individuals committed heinous crimes. All of these individuals are involved in, as the president and the Secretary of Defense like to say, poisoning the youth of America. There's no Republican versus Democrat ideology here that separates a common American government perception that illegal narcotics are bad for the United States. They're bad for the world and for any population for that matter. However, the issue is that ends, ways, and means matter, and how you accomplish a national security task is as important as whether or not you accomplish it. And so I think that even though there are many people in the United States, certainly many people in the president's base of political support, who may live in places that are horribly affected by fentanyl and opioid overdoses, they're not going to waste the time to listen to somebody like me explain that only 8 to 12% of the cocaine that comes out of the Andes comes from Venezuela and reaches U.S. shores. They're not going to be too terribly disturbed about my distinction that it's not cocaine that kills Americans, it's fentanyl. When you just lump them all under the term narco-terrorists, it becomes easy to support politically, and that's what President Trump and his team are counting on, as I believe they violate international and U.S. law.
Let's zoom out and look at how, again, if we presume that this is not about narco-terrorism and is about threatening or intimidating Venezuela, do you detect from this White House an overarching plan for Latin America? And where might this Venezuela episode fit into that?
That's a really difficult question for me to answer, because you're talking to somebody who has served Republican and Democrat administrations over several decades and who has participated in the planning. And I'm not in the planning of an overarching strategy right now. I live in Washington, I read and I speak to a lot of people. But the fact is, I have no view into what their strategic thinking is beyond an assumption that Donald Trump himself, as an individual leader, believes in the spheres of influence sort of, approach to world power. There are basically 3 big powers right now, the United States, China, and Russia, the deference that Trump shows to Vladimir Putin beyond all rational explanation leads me to conclude that he believes Putin should have his sphere of influence, Xi Jinping in China should have his sphere of influence, and Donald Trump should have his sphere of influence. Well, that logically is the Americas. And it would explain why in January he started to speak about retaking Greenland and the Panama Canal. So if this is the Donroe Doctrine, as some have called it, and his notion is that he should be the top dog, or the United States should be the top dog in a hemisphere, in a Western hemisphere, that has somebody like Nicolás Maduro, who is obviously a very nefarious actor who runs a regime that violates the human rights of Venezuelans and has taken what once was a relatively prosperous country and put it in the economic dumper. Well, then it kind of stands to reason that if he's not too worried about the niceties of international law, maybe taking this guy out with a huff and a puff and making his regime collapse, or maybe even putting a missile on top of Miraflores Palace in Caracas, would be perfectly in keeping with Trump's view that, as Thucydides, the Greek historian, said 2,500 years ago, hey, the strong do what they will, the weak do what they must.
We'll leave it there. Good talking to you. Thanks for guiding us through that so clearly. John Feeley from the Centre for Media Integrity of the Americas.